Okay, we'll get going. I have it set to record again. As you notice on the Moodle, I have Tuesdays recorded too. I don't know if we're gonna do this every time, but I know right now we still have students that are quarantining or not are missing class, so I'll record it again today. The whole recording thing was a whole fiasco. So the school has said record if you can, but then no one seems to know how to then take that recording and put it anywhere useful like a Moodle. Like the business office doesn't know and the other faculty doesn't know. We all asked each other. I don't know. So I figured it out. So it's there on Moodle. It led to a whole thing. I was watching it, trying to make sure it recorded and then making sure I'm doing a good job. And I thought I was slouching a little bit. So I went to the bathroom and I was like stretching just so I wouldn't slouch as much. And as I was stretching, I have a big bathroom, but I hit both walls. And I thought, that's weird. It's like, hold my wife it. And I was like, it's like, look at this. I can hit both walls. That's not normal, right? She's like, oh, you didn't know you're a freak? Apparently I have unusually long arms and she's always known, and I didn't realize that. I guess she has to buy extra long shirts for me because my arms are so long. But she said the good news is she said that she likes that about me because I have able to hold it. So it turned into a wholesome moment. But anyway, I was laughing so much at her calling me a freak that I pulled my neck because I was showing her and I started laughing. So I'm all stiff and I didn't sleep very well. So if I seem spacey today, that's why. It's all because I had to record on Tuesday. But we're going to record again and continue to record while we have people out. I'm logged into the Zoom. So again, the Zoom is not, you guys should be here in class. The Zoom is, if you're in quarantine or something, join the Zoom. But otherwise, you should be in class and not join the Zoom. Oh, that's what I wanted. Okay, practice problems 1 and 3 should already been turned in. If you haven't, I'm still taking them today. I'll actually still take them on Tuesday if you haven't turned it in yet. Practice problems chapter 7 due Tuesday. I know it says in the syllabus today, but you just being flexible with you guys. One of the problems in the practice problems that it says to go to a website and tell me what GDP is, and then that website is not to be found. Just do your best. Google it. There's a couple subparts. See if you can Google the information. Again, I'm not grading this. You're not going to get a grade like an A. So this is practice problems to you. The kind of stuff that'll be on the midterm and final. So I need you to understand some of those concepts. So Googling the answers will help you solidify those concepts. Okay, how come we can't get the projector on? All right, let's try this again. You guys all look beat. Has it been a long day? Yeah. Yeah, I'm right there with you. First week back on campus. Does anybody have classes tomorrow? You have classes on Friday? Oh, man. Well, we'll make the day a little bit shorter of a day. I don't think there's any presentations today. Right? Is anybody expecting to do a presentation today? No? Okay, so we'll get out of here a little bit early. Maybe make your week a little easier. Ah, finally. Okay. Okay, well, let's start with this fortuitous article I found in the New York Times this morning about GDP. So the final numbers came in for December. Our economy grew at 1.7% for the fourth quarter, making a total of, I think it says 6.9%. Yes, so 6.9% for the year. That's amazing growth. And a little bit outside the scope of this class, we don't really get into this kind of depth of GDP growth, but the US, a strong year for the US is typically 3% growth, which is unusual. For the rest of the world, we look at 5 to 8% as strong growth, but for us, 3%. And it has to do with a couple different things. One being that we're the largest economy for the world. So we're just such a powerhouse that any growth is good, but other economies are smaller. There's a lot of room for growth. But it's very, very unusual for us to grow at nearly 7%. What you also might have read in the news recently, though, is that inflation was also around 7% last year. So we're going to start learning today about how they correspond, GDP and inflation. But overall, this is a tremendous news story. Definitely not in recession. We talked about recession last time. Recession is when GDP growth slows way down or stops. 6%, 7% is not only not a recession, it's the strongest maybe in my lifetime. Okay. So let's get into GDP. So this is the first real substantive chapter we're going to go over. Remember, the first chapter was the principles of economics. The third chapter was getting a supply and demand. And then we talked on Tuesday about just like basic macroeconomic concepts. What macroeconomics is all about. Well, let's get into some substance. So the problem GDP, what we learn about GDP, the problem it's solving is how do you compare the strength of an economy or the growth of an economy year after year? And how do you compare country to country? Well, what we've decided to do is use gross domestic product to do that. So gross domestic product, as we'll learn, is one way of measuring growth. There are some other ways that you might have heard: gross national product. So gross national product, which we don't get into in this class, is gross domestic product plus a few areas where we can look at where we're making money in the economy from foreign sources. But we don't really cover that. It's not used as widespread. GDP is used, and the key word there is domestic. We're not, GNP factors in some foreign stuff. GDP is only looking at US, or if you're in China, only looking at China. So again, more practical reasons. So how do you compare, how do you know if China's economy is bigger than the US economy? I guess the matter question is why would you want to know that? Who cares? But if you did want to know that, this is the predominant way you can measure that using GDP. You get GDP through national accounts. National accounts are data gathering done by governments and also like non-government entities, but the official national accounts are done by the government. And they track all sorts of metrics. How much people are spending in a year, how much we're exporting, how much we're importing. You could correlate how advanced an economy is with how solid these national account numbers are. So the US is going to have pretty solid accounting of these numbers. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is not going to have, or North Korea is not going to have accurate numbers. It's because the economy is not as advanced. They don't prioritize those numbers. You also see a lot of corruption in certain countries, and these numbers are up. There's been, over the years, even advanced countries like US and China has had questions about the validity of their national accounts, but this information is validated through third-party sources that track as much as they can these numbers. Okay, and so here's some examples of national accounts. Consumer spending. So we track all consumer spending by households on goods and services. And we track all government spending on goods and services. So what's government spending? Well, that's when the government buys things for itself. Right? The military buys guns for itself. The FBI buys badges. Right? You know, pencils, anything the government buys for itself to use. Investment spending. So this is businesses and others that spend money on physical things that are productive. Machinery, industrial robots, new factories, a road to the factory. And then finally, goods and services that are exported to other countries and goods and services that are imported to our country. All right, so this is in the book. It shows the circular nature of an economy. So we're going to talk about financial markets later, but we can kind of ignore this for now. But as you can see, everything is connected. So we have our household consumer spending here. We have our government spending here, right? And then that goes into income and sales to firms. That consumers and governments are buying things from firms, right? And then they're paying their employees wages. The wages go back to the households. And then the exports here. So it's a big circle. Everything's connected. All right, so then we're going to break down GDP a little bit more. So the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. Right? Every word here is important. You can't skip over any word here. Right? It's final goods. So these are things that are being sold to the end user of the product, not intermediate goods. Intermediate goods meaning like the things the producer makes to sell, like iron ore and steel that sells to a car manufacturer. Well, the car manufacturer is not the final consumer of that steel. The person that buys the car is. So the steel is not a final good. So it's not counted here. Goods and services. Right? So we're not talking about abstract things. We're talking about something that's made, or like, I'm a lawyer, so when I go get somebody legal advice, it's a service. Produced within a country, so we're only concerned about the domestic nature of the numbers, and over a time period, in a year. Okay, so there's 3 ways we can calculate GDP. Now the book goes on about this kind of complicated way that uses this, and I never quite understood how it explains it. But essentially, it's trying to say that this amount of money should equal this amount of money, which I guess makes sense. But anyway, I don't understand how the book explains it that very well, but I do think this explains the 3 different ways really well. So this table is microeconomy. And these are the 3 entities in our economy: the ore company, the steel company, and the car company. And if we take this as a simplified, in the real economy, there'd be millions of different columns here for different companies and entities and people. But our simplified has 3. So there's 3 different ways here of showing how we can get GDP. They're separate. Each one you do one or the other. You don't do all 3. So one way is you look at the value of production of final goods and services, right, is the sum of the value added at each stage. So for some reason, this is often like the most confusing one to students, and I agree, but it's really simple, so don't make it too hard. American ore, right? They're digging up ore out of the ground, so they don't have any input costs. I mean, in reality they would, but in our simplified version, they're not buying ore anywhere else. They're digging it; it's free, and then they do whatever to it, and then they sell it to the steel company. So their total value added to the economy is $4,200, because that's what they sold it for, and they had no intermediate goods cost. And then the steel company takes that ore and turns it into steel, and they sold it for $9 grand. But they had to buy the ore for $4,200. So the difference between these two is how much value they added. They took $4,200 worth of steel or ore and turned it into $9,000 worth of steel. So they added $4,800 in value to the economy. And then the car company took that $9,000 of steel and made a car and sold that to the final consumer. So they take the final sales price, subtract what their input costs were, and they added $12,500 of value. So if you add it up every step of the way, the value added, you come up with $21,500 is the GDP of this tiny economy. Right? Really simple, really simple. At every stage, you take the sales price and subtract the cost of their inputs, their intermediates. Sales price, subtract cost, that's the values. And then you add up all the values to get the GDP. So that's way one. Way two is aggregate spending on domestically produced final goods and services. This one's the simplest. So we only have this one highlighted. Remember GDP, the simplest definition? The value of all final goods and services? Well, this is the only final goods and services. So the value. So GDP is 21,500. Now, if you're really astute, you'll think, oh, hey, this number, this way of calculating comes up with this way of calculating. Same answer. That's what we want, right? Because this is only one GDP. We're just figuring out different ways to get there. If we figured out this way and then we figured out this way and we had two different numbers, we know we made mistakes. The third way is this adding up market factors, money factors. So this one's a little bit different. Think about it. So this is what they sold the car for. Well, all this money that came from the buyer into these companies, what do the companies do with it? That's where this weird flow, right? So the consumer bought on the market from a firm of a car, 21,500 went to here. So where does that 21,500 go? Well, it goes here. So if you add up where it goes, you'll then know, if you add that all up, you'll know what GDP is. And in this case, we can break it out that each of these stages paid wages for the workers. They made interest payments on equipment, rent on their factories, and then the owners took home profit of this amount. So you didn't add this up, and you know what your GDP is. So again, it should equal the same. We're getting the same answer three different ways. Why do I keep emphasizing that? This is in the practice problem, something very similar, and this is also on the midterm. And every time I give that midterm, I have students that come up with, it says figure out GDP using three different ways. And every time I'll get different GDP numbers. Don't do that. If nothing else, put the same number and I'll give you partial credit. Because that's part of understanding the GDP is not changing. You're figuring out in different ways. All right, any questions on this one? Yeah.
Does the GDP round up or does it cut off?
It's typically rounded. Yeah. So, yeah, it's rounded to, just normal rounding rules. Yeah, and none of the problems that we do, I don't think have, well, I guess some of them do get pretty deep, they get specific on numbers. Just round it. This is macro. We don't care about dollars and cents. We care about the billions and trillions. Okay, so GDP measures production, right? It's measuring what we're producing. So it does not include things that is not production. So it does not include used goods. If something was already made and sold, and then now it's used and resold, we don't care about that. It's no longer a final good. Also, it does not include financial assets, stocks and bonds. It is a little bit more nuanced, but for our class, for our purposes, we exclude the financial markets. So GDP does not include used, does not include intermediate goods, goods going from producer to producer, and does not include financial products like stocks and bonds. Right? And within a country, only domestic. What do I mean? Cars produced in Mexico by American firms are not included. So Fords, most Fords are actually made, Detroit company, US company are made in Mexico. A lot of them are. Those contribute to Mexico's GDP, not ours. Vice versa, Toyota, a Japanese company makes most of their cars that are sold in the US. So Toyota sales contribute to our GDP. Okay, and all these numbers are only meaningful if we have a time period. So you get GDP is typically over a year. Now, the article I showed you said quarter. So we do measure it in the quarter, but we care in our analysis over the course of a year. Okay, so what's in? Final goods and services, capital goods, new construction of structures, changes in inventories. These are all GDP. What's not included? Intermediate goods and services, inputs, ore to steel to cars, input. Used goods, financial assets, and goods and services produced outside the country. Okay, so we went through this pretty much in detail. The value added method, you look at what each step of the way, you take what they sold it for, you subtract what they bought it for, and that's the value added. Spending is the second way. You look at what was spent on the final goods and services, the whole car, whatever. Okay. So these two ways can be simplified in this formula. You will also need to know this formula. If no other formula in this whole class, you need to take this one away with you. GDP equals consumer spending, investment spending, plus government purchases of goods and services, plus sales to foreigners, so exports, minus imports. So for the midterm, you will have to know how the 3 different ways to get a GDP and this formula. So here's how, we calculate different ways, but it should always add up the same. So here we can calculate it up by value added. Here it's the final goods and purchases. So this is the consumer spending plus investment plus government spending, and then your trade deficit, because we in the US run at a trade deficit. So we have this negative here. It all adds up if we add up the value. So value added by business, value added by households, value added by government. Okay, anybody have any idea what value added by households means? Value added by business makes a lot of sense. Ford takes steel, makes it into a car. They added value. McDonald's takes food and makes it, takes it in a Big Mac. It has value. What value is households? So we're not talking about the house itself, because the house, a new house being built is done by a business. The household, how does that add value? Yeah.
Labor.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit more.
Well, households are people who need people in order to use products, and that comes in labor.
Yeah, so you are right on the right track, but just slightly up. So what the labor you're describing would be accounted for by adding to business. And if you're working from home, like you have your own home business, right? That's a business. But you're close on this, and it's a special kind of labor. And it's in the chapter, goes in a little bit more. And when these inquiring minds, it says are imputed lives. And what value added by households is a couple things. And one of those things is when a couple, say, gets married, maybe they're both working, so they're both contributing to value added by business. Let's say one of them, after they get married, quits and stays home to take care of the house, to clean the house, to raise kids. That's adding value to our economy. Now, if they're just staying home and eating Cheetos on the couch, that's not adding any value. But if they're doing stuff like raising kids or cleaning, something that maybe you would otherwise pay a house cleaner for. That's adding value. We call that imputed value because we can't exactly measure it. What's the value of a housewife or a stay-at-home mom? Well, you could add up what it would cost for daycare, or you can add up what it would cost for a house cleaner. You can kind of get an idea of what the value they're adding. So that's that. There's also what is the value of to GDP if you buy a house versus renting? There's some value added by renting you have to account for. Okay, so now we have an idea what GDP is. So now let's dig into that a little bit, because there's something called real GDP and something called nominal GDP. And the difference is prices change every year. Things affect prices. So if we're figuring out GDP by looking at the prices of everything, the value, market value, which means what things sold for, then if prices change, how do you account for that in GDP? Well, the end goal is to come up with two different numbers, a nominal GDP, which is just the current prices, and then a real GDP, which accounts for that price change. So what are we talking about here? So in this simplified example, we have in over 2 years, we have quantity of apples sold in the economy in billions. It goes up by 200 in year 2. And then the price of apples also changes. And then the quantity of oranges, it goes up by 200 again. Price of orange also goes up. So if we just do, the price versus the amount sold, and price versus the amount sold and add it up, it looks like our GDP is 1,000 year 1 and 1,500 year 2. So it looks like GDP went up by 50%. Well, that's huge. But that doesn't quite jive, right? Because how can our GDP go by 50% if we only increase the sales by whatever that is, 10%, 12%? So obviously it's not right. We don't have 50% more value in our economy. We only have, 11% averaging the growth in quantity. So what we have to do is figure out a way to factor out that price change so we can compare year to year. And when we do that, we get a real GDP of 1150. So our actual GDP growth is only, whatever that is, 15%, whatever, 11.5%. So we don't have all the pieces of information we need yet to figure it out, but there's some relationships here that kind of help to understand. So when we factor out inflation or price changes to get real GDP, we do that by taking a year and comparing the other years to that year. And the year we do is the base year. So in this example, you see in 2009, our nominal and our real equal the same. So just what we could figure out from that is that we're using 2009 as our base year to compare the other years to it. So what we do is we have to figure out in 2009, we have to figure out for 2003, what the price changes were, what's the inflation rate. And then once we have that rate, we can then figure out what real GDP was and compare. So we saw this is the real growth from 2003 to 2009. Same thing here. Once we have that price index, which we're going to get to in a minute, we can then use that price index from our base year to figure out from the target year and see the real change. So inflation always goes up. So another relationship we can see is that in our base year, nominal is going to equal real every time in our base year. So if I give you a table, you'll instantly know it has a bunch of years, which is the base year to use, because you'll see, oh, they equal. So it has to be the base year. The other thing is, and because inflation goes up, prices go up, we can see the relationship between the base year and the previous years. So what we should see is that in years previous to the base year, nominal is lower than real. But then going forward, because prices go up every year, nominal should be higher than real. Okay, we don't have all the pieces for this yet. So if you haven't read the chapter, it might be confusing. Once we get the second piece of information in a second, and you work through the practice problems, this becomes a lot easier. I agree that just right conceptually, this is kind of a hard concept. Work through the practice problem, which I think is like problem 6 in the practice problem, and you'll get it down. This is not an area where most students struggle once they understand it and work through the first problem. Okay, so this summary, what I was saying there, in the base year, real GDP always equals nominal GDP. Other than the base year, they'll never equal. And what we do is we call it chaining the dollars. What is how we get that calculation to factor out the price change. All right, and then kind of lastly, concept that's important to understand is GDP per capita. We don't use GDP per capita a whole lot, but we can, and we can start to figure out with GDP per capita how that affects individuals and their well-being and other factors that affect individual at the individual scale instead of the macro scale. So here's these are Western countries that are generally considered the best to live in, and you pull them and say, are you rate how you're thriving, and you compare that to individual GDP per capita, and you see that the countries that are generally considered the best to live in with the happiest people are also the ones that are high on GDP per capita. So, Sweden, Denmark, United States. And there's a definite relationship between less GDP per capita and self-reported well-being. There is some work in economics about, is there a level of income that matters? Or is there always more income is happier or more well-being? And this work shows that around in the United States, around 100,000 is the level in which, until you get that, every dollar you make makes you happier. And then after you get that, every dollar you make diminishes its return in making you happier. So there is some work around that, but in general, at a certain level, more money everyone has in the economy, the happier they are. But of course, GDP per capita, we're not talking about individual income, we're talking about averages. So in the United States, of course, we have the most billionaires in the world and most millionaires. And we also have an extremely large amount of very low income people. So not everyone has that same GDP. Okay, so the other piece we're missing when we're talking about the base year stuff is the price index. So this is how we start figuring out changes in price levels. So our aggregate price level is a measure of overall level of prices in the economy. So how do we get that? Well, I was surprised to learn when I was learning economics in college, is that they literally get that. Economists go out to stores, thousands of stores a year, and just mark the prices down. So if they're checking for apples, they'll go to apples, they'll look at apple prices all over the country and average out the apple price for this year. So I mean, literally, there's economists like scouring stores, tracking prices. Of course, I don't know now if they use the internet or what, if they still actually go to stores. But that's how we do inflation. So when you see the big bad inflation report on the nightly news, that's made up from people just going out and with their pencil and paper and writing down prices. So we use this market basket. So a market basket would look something like this, a very simplified one, but every year they would look at the prices of an orange. They would look at the prices of a grapefruit. You know, this random assortment of goods. You know, look at those prices and average them out. And then once you have all those prices averaged out, you can then come up with this thing called the price index. So this is a index, a number, a percentage of the cost in that basket. So you take the cost of the market basket in a given year, and then you divide it by the base year. So if you want to find out inflation from 2020 to 2021, you would take your average price basket here of 21, put it here, and then your base year is 2020, you put it here, divide it, and then times 100, and then you get your price index. Okay, and then that's just part of it. The price index is just the first step. Price index is not inflation. So we can look at the inflation rate then by taking our price index from year 2, subtracting it from year 1, and then dividing by year 1. So we already did this. We already did this formula come with a price index. So we have price index from 20 to 21, and maybe we have price index from 2020 or 2010 to 2011. And then we take those two and we subtract 2010 from 2020 and over 2010 times 100. And then what we would end up with is an inflation rate over the last decade. Right. So there's several different market baskets used, but generally it's a basket of goods that a typical urban American family would use in a year. Of course, this changes over time. My parents bought different things in the 80s and 70s than I buy now. And my kids buy different things. So that changes over time, but consistent, they try to be consistent. If the basket was different every time, then it would be useless. So here's what the categories of a major basket is. 40% housing prices, right? 3% apparel. Over here we have transportation, but they exclude motor fuel. And one of the reasons why they do that is because some baskets that you hear about, inflation indexes, price indexes, will exclude gas and oil altogether because it's too volatile. It throws off the inflation rate too much. Your recreation, education, medical care. So when we say inflation is up 7%, what we're saying is they took sample prices last year in these categories, and then they took prices again a year later, and they did those formulas, and they come up with, on average of all these things, prices have gone up 7%. Now, what does that mean, though? Does that mean if you bought a TV a year ago, it's 7% higher now? Could be, but probably not, because most likely the fact that healthcare has gone up 20% and housing has gone up 20% is swaying some of the others. And education. Did your guys' tuition go up this year? Probably. When I went to law school, my tuition the first year was something like 15,000. And year 2, they doubled it. It was like 28,000 or something like that. Yeah, what are you going to do? I'm going to drop out after a year of law school? No, I'm going to finish, but it was ridiculous. Okay, yeah. So here's what consumer price index looks graphed over since 1930. So you'll see that through the Great Depression, there was not a lot of inflation. In fact, there was deflation, right? It's really bad. There was deflation in early 20s. World War I and the Spanish flu caused economic problems. Again, the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a Great Depression because of how long it lasted here without inflation. I'm going to go up, and then like here in the 70s and 80s, we did this huge jump. So that was stagflation, where inflation was way up, but the economy, GDP growth was way down. And then we have this weird thing for the last year. This is really weird because inflation kind of leveled out. yet our economy grew at leaps and bounds. So inflation was actually historically low over this time period. And then, of course, when the new edition of the book comes out, this graph will show 2021, and it'll be steeper again. Okay, CPI is not the only price index. Producer price index is the pricing of those inputs producers make, so the pricing of ore, steel, grain. It's not used as much. It's used, I mean, it's used quite often for producers, but it's not used as much as an indicator of overall inflation because input prices can change dramatically. A bad winter might make wheat prices go through the roof, but that's not going to change the cost of bread too much economy-wide. So producer price index is a little bit more volatile. There's also the GDP deflator, which is that whole formula we're talking about, where you go to the base year to see what the change in prices is years by year. So you can graph that and see how the difference between real and nominal GDP changes every year. And this is what it looks like all laid on top of each other. The pink is producer price index. So you see it's very volatile, very dramatic changes. Let's see, the CPI is the green, which is typically what we consider as inflation. Same trend as PPI, but much less dramatic. And then the GDP deflator. You'll notice the GDP deflator, it doesn't quite line up. It's a leading indicator. The GDP deflator will indicate what's going to happen with inflation quite often before it happens. The problem with it being a leading indicator is you can't actually do it until you can't calculate it in real time. So it doesn't work too much as a leading indicator. But in hindsight, it shows. Okay. I know we take a break, and then we do our presentations and quiz, but why don't we just do the, oh, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about one of the practice problems. I think we talked about it.
Yeah, which one?
It's 8A.
Yeah, what it's
It's for practice management.
yeah. So why is real GDP greater than nominal GDP for all years?
Is that because the base years in between 2005 and 2015?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. Problem 8 in the practice problems is the one I've gotten the most people coming to office hours to ask me for. And it's also this one very similar in the midterm. And it's the one most people get right. Because once you go through it once, you get those relationships and it makes sense. Okay, well let's do the quiz, and then you guys will be good to go off of that.
Can I just turn up my chapter?
Oh yeah, for which one? Chapter 7?
Chapter 1.
Okay. Yeah, if you have the
I don't have any.
that's fine. Chapter 1. If you have your practice problems for chapter 1 and 3, turn them in. Again, I'll give you till Tuesday, and chapter 7 on Tuesday too. Here's the quiz. So go ahead and get that done, and then take off when you're done, but quietly, please.
So do you just want these turned in handwritten?
Yeah, just handwritten.